Hey guys, thanks for joining me for another episode. MotoD Racing was super cool to send me the IRC Quickshifter for my RC Cup bike. And to my left is standing Curtis Tom, and he is a former crew chief for a Yamaha R6 team. So I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to invite Curtis once again. He worked on my R6, did a wonderful job, and today he's going to be working on the KTM RC Cup bike to get this installed. So before we begin, he's going to do a little unboxing of the IRC Quickshifter and walk you through the process of getting this installed.
Okay, so in the IRC components kit, you will find instructions, the new shift rod, the shift sensor, and the control unit. Underneath this pretty packaging, you will find the remainder of the components, the instruction sheet, the wiring harness, and the rest of the hardware to complete the installation of the shift rod. So the harness arrives to you already plugged in. Give you some hints on what goes where on their side, which is quite nice. Which, as you can see, there's a grand total of one connector, making it very simple. We have our ground, our interrupt so that we can supply power to the unit, the connectors that will go to the injector and act as our interrupt, because this system is fuel cut interrupt. That's very important to understand that what we are actually going to be using to enable the quick shifting is not an interruption of the spark, but of the fuel delivery, and that's going to facilitate a much smoother transition back to power. Reason being is that we're not loading the cylinder up with an entire charge, maybe, I don't know, how many revolutions is a couple milliseconds. When a ignition cut refires, there's unburned gases left in the combustion chamber. Those light off at their will. We are not in control of it. That creates a rough re-engagement of the power. The fuel cut prevents fuel from building up in the cylinder because the ignition is never shut off. You end up with a dry cylinder, and then when we resupply fuel, it smoothly refires at the appropriate time, not upsetting the chassis and allowing us to drive out under maximum efficiency. All right, so first step in this process is going to be to get to the battery area, which we know is under the front. We're going to pull the seat off and get the go ahead and get access to the battery and plan our layout of where the control box will ride in the tail section. That's correct. The street version is a little bit different in the way the tail section comes apart. Facilitate for the lighting and all the DOT required equipment. So we have lots of room under here. So located here is the Kuber ECU, which is an add-on component to this competition bike. So their intention is to have this grounded. Now it might be tempting to go to a chassis ground with this, but the Italians went out of their way to tell you to ground it at the battery. I'm not going to ask them why. We're just going to follow the directions. So the only wire that's required to go up to the front in this loom is the wire for the ground to the battery. And due to its small size, I'm going to see if I get lucky and can pass it up the left-hand side of the bodywork. That is the tank cover. Well, as I've said in the previous videos, take your time and take stuff off. If nothing else, it'll give you an opportunity to clean it, make you more familiar with your motorcycle, and have some appreciation for the professionals that spin wrenches at the dealerships. Okay, the two screws for the front on the sides are different lengths. The left is longer. So when you put them back in, the left one is the longer of the two. There we go.
Go ahead and scan this.
So the tank, to get it off, after you have to remove the cap to get the cover off. The cover slides over 4 locating pins on the sides. So you do have to flex out on the side panel to get the tank cover out and around. Obviously you'd want to stuff some rags in there if you're worried about scratching up your plastics. Or take the side panels off first if you have that much time and want to protect the look of your bike at that level. So the next connector that we need to track down is going to be our injector connector. To install is an interrupt for the injector, and then routed this back to our control juncture based on the fact that the aftermarket piggyback control unit exists, and it is currently plugged in and interrupting the signal going to the injector. We need to ensure that when we interrupt the signal that we're doing it post-modification of the fuel and not allowing the secondary controller to actually send fuel when we're requesting it to stop. So we have to install this against the injector and ahead or behind, between the injector and any additional accessories. So in a standard installation, you could simply identify the injector connector, disconnect it, and install these, the interrupt on their appropriate male-female sides. In this case, I need to make sure I'm identifying the OEM connector from the injector and disconnecting that one first. So this is the connector we're trying to remove. I'm inspecting it so I can understand that the release mechanism is a press down and then a pull. And its orientation will almost always be this side facing the injector. So that's what I'm going to attempt to compress and remove. So the connector that we need to get to is directly on the throttle body, and it's plugged directly onto the injector. So the injector plug is off finally. It is back in here. It can take a little bit of finessing to get off, but it will eventually come off. So there's the injector. We've got it disconnected now from the standard harness and the secondary harness. We're going to go ahead and pre-run our wiring up the left-hand side of the tank here. Since I don't know what we have to work with after we plug this one in, I'm going to go ahead and plug this into what I unplugged before. I'm going to do that first. This goes back to the connector we were working so diligently to remove earlier. Make sure you have it with the lock facing forward. So the next step is going to be to go ahead and find the location to mount our control unit. We need to be able to access the display and the buttons on the control unit to make any adjustments in the future. All our connectors are readily accessible and in the same area. This is the ground circuit. As requested, battery ground, so we will provide it a battery ground. We will not outsmart them and give it to a chassis ground. As with any accessories, you want to install the accessories against the bolt, leaving the OEM harnesses to be the first to contact the battery. That always ensures the best charge rate and stable electronics function of the motorcycle. The shift rod that comes in the box needs to be modified and cut at the two reliefs. That would make it the appropriate length to replace the standard shift rod and allow for the addition of the sensor and to reach this total length. The shift rod as supplied in the box is too long, and it will be nearly impossible. In fact, I can confirm it would be impossible to put this shift rod in and have it come out to a usable length without modification. So we made the decision that we're going to go ahead and modify this shift rod and cut it in its indicated locations to utilize it in this application with the Power Sports aftermarket rear sets. I'm going to go ahead and make those modifications, and in the meantime we'll be reinstalling the bodywork, and then once I return with the modified component, we'll continue the installation. Let's pre-organize this now, because when we put the tank cover on, we're going to cover it here. So this is the connector between the interrupt harness going to our injectors and the main harness going to our controller. The accessory wire here that is unused, this is a green analog output wire. You can tap this and connect it to a data system if you were interested in recording data logging. All right, so we have all of this in a manner which...
You want the double-sided tape?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that if you're...
It's Velcro, by the way.
Are you happy with this location of everything?
Yeah, that's fine with me. Okay. As long as we have, we have access to the control, so that's good. I think in the future you could get away with doing just the left-hand side. Obviously, the identification process of where the connectors are
with the aftermarket piggyback unit made this a little more complicated than a standard job, but it was definitely worthwhile to make sure we had our connectors correctly identified. So I've just returned from San Diego BMW, and the owner, Gary Orr, was quite nice enough and quite experienced at cutting these shift rods because he's made a bunch of them himself. And he was able to shorten this shift rod, as you can see, nice and clean, perfectly straight, so that our lock nuts have a flat surface to lock against. And that's the one thing you want to be careful of when you do cut or shorten a shift rod, is that you get a perpendicular cut and a good flat surface so that your lock nuts or your heim joints have a good surface to mate against and hold their torque. I disassembled the old shift rod after making a measurement from the eye-to-eye location. This shift rod has been reassembled and tightened in the exact same length from the center of the eye to the center of the eye, and that will put the shift pedal right back in the same position where we found it. Or the bolt and the spacer that we had removed previously. Remember that the spacer goes between the pedal and the heim joint, and then the bolt goes in from the other side. Make sure that our shift rod is nice and free and can rotate both heims to their extremes, and that seems about right. Now I'll pick a routing for our wire, remembering that we want to keep it away from hot surfaces. So obviously the exhaust in here is going to be our #1 source of heat. We also don't want to route it anywhere near where the chain may get to. So it would have to be secured in some fashion. What would be really tricky would be to remove this cover and slot it up here, allowing the wire to have a non-compressed pass-through and trapped by the cover, but keeping it outside and away from the chain run, giving it support here, and then being able to continue up to the frame rail. And I would secure it there, and then I would actually secure it there, back side of here. And there's our termination point. So let's go ahead, and before we secure everything for the final time, we'll go ahead and power it up, make sure it still starts, and do any programming or checking of the controller unit. Will it resolve itself at startup?
Is this supposed to be lit up or no?
Not constantly, because there's no necessity for it. Well, the bike starts and operates as normal, which is good. We're going to go ahead and complete the IRC quick setup guide to ensure that we have the push-pull programmed into the controller correctly. And we're simply going to follow the instructions here because they went out of their way to print us a whole separate set of quick start instructions aside from their primary ones. So we have the bike set up for pull function is the direction of our shifting. On their display, E means pulling. So when the controller is powered up, it did power up and it did display a number 14 at key on. You're going to push and hold both buttons. You're going to wait for a click sound, 2 seconds. So now we're going to push the lower button to scroll to the menu options until you reach the value of CE. Hold down the lower button to enter the C submenu. Press the lower button to toggle the selection of your choice. C is pushing. That is incorrect for our application. You press the upper button, not the lower button. Their instructions are incorrect. To confirm the setting, exit from the submenus, press and hold down the upper button. Until you actually write it, their suggestion is, and of course my suggestion is, and our recent experience has been, go try out the stock settings first, and then the instructions I put back in the box, but they basically tell you on the quick start is that we have the sensor secured. The only thing we haven't done is adjust the preload, how much foot force is required to trigger, because we don't have any data to react from yet. So we're going to leave that alone and leave it at standard. There is obviously a method here to adjust it so that if you find that it is overly sensitive or even not sensitive enough, you can come in here and use what they suggest to change the actual amount of force prior to an upshift cut request. If the system is enabled in 6th gear, because it does not have a gear position sensor and you depress the pedal when you're already in top gear, it will cut. So some of this force adjustment can be used to patch over riding technique that maybe you can't get around because you have big feet and your feet cover the pedals, and sometimes due to vibration they depress the shift pedal a little bit. That's where the sensitivity adjustment comes into play, where you can get rid of unwanted or errant cuts by taking the sensitivity out of it, making the force request higher to initiate it. So the units that we were looking at, T is the cut time, most likely time in milliseconds. We'd have to see what their adjustment range is because they don't really tell us. The TP is the cut type. In this case, we only have one cut type, and that's fuel cut. We don't have the option to go to ignition cut. The SR is the minimum required RPM for the upshift to start working. Most of these bikes are set at 1,000, 2,000 RPM. You know, right at idle. They're not going to work anyway. So there is what they also call a smoothness setting. Set this to the ideal RPM you want to upshift. I'm going to say that's probably an output for the TAC, probably a shift light, if you want to call it that. And then there's controls for blipper functions that this bike unfortunately does not possess due to its age and the fact that this shifter is only going to work in the upshifting direction. Let's secure the unit and finalize our wire placement and install the seat, and you'll be ready to go test that at the racetrack.